Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our second collab between SurgSoc and MedSoc. We're thrilled to be hosting a talk this evening on something that is definitely brushed over all too much in both our studies and in the clinical practice that we're exposed to in our early years. So getting down with the drip, as this evening's talk is aptly named, it's to help provide a much-needed infusion of knowledge to remedy all those times. Thanks. I'll be here all night. So we're here to remedy all those times that you might have put a drip up on a patient and looked at the drip rate and thought, yeah, it looks all right. And for all those times you wandered into the fluids room in C15 and didn't really know what you were looking for, but just grabbed the first thing that you saw. And of course, for all those times you did a write-up and just included fluid resuscitation. So hopefully we can shed some light on that, and we're privileged this evening to have two guest speakers with a veritable wealth of knowledge and experience in both emergency surgery and medicine, and we look forward to hearing from them this evening. Just a few things to announce. For those of you that weren't at our AGM this week, we have some exciting news, and that is SurgSoc's 2019 Executive Com. We're proud to announce that Nick Loxton will be our president for next year. Give him a round of applause. Then we'll have our vice presidents will be Kath McDougall and Gareth Aubrey, if we can give them a round of applause as well. And Stuart Steenkamp, our secretary, and Musa Omar will be our treasurer for next year. So again, one last round of applause. Committee applications are now open. For those of you interested, you can find more information on our Vula page about what kind of portfolios are open. What we require is just a very brief CV and a motivation for why you'd like to take on the role. So those applications are now open. Get involved, please, guys. More exciting leadership news. So for those of you that were fortunate to attend the International Association of Student Surgical Society Symposium earlier this year, which was co-hosted by UCT and Stellenbosch, we now have some new leadership at the IASS with a good UCT representation. So Nick will be the vice president of that, so we can give him a round of applause again. And then as well, Liam Devonish, Capacity Director, Josh Fegan, the Office Secretary, Isabel Kim will be part of the editorial, and Gareth Aubrey, a member of the Academy as well. So one big round of applause for them again. And then just an announcement from the MedSoc side, the committee applications will be opening soon, so keep your eyes peeled for that. One last announcement from SurgSoc side. So global health and global surgery is somewhat of a buzz term that's lost a bit of its substance, some would say, over the last few years. But in 2015, the Lancet Commission on Global Surgery really helped to tie together a lot of what people in the field of surgery were thinking about the provision of more equitable surgical services across the world. And there's some really crucial information that they put across there in terms of indicators of surgical care. And as students, we're not really exposed to this way of thinking, of optimizing systems to adequately provide care. And so what we're looking at doing in October this year is providing a workshop where you're exposed to some of the thought processes behind this and get an opportunity to be faced with some real-life cases and start thinking critically about the environments you'll be working in the future. So this is a short video to kind of highlight what global surgery is all about.
Over the past 2 decades, global health has focused on individual diseases. Surgical care has been afforded low priority in the world's poorest regions, leaving 5 billion people without access to safe, affordable surgical and anesthesia care. Patients requiring surgical treatment will face multiple hurdles: delay in seeking care, delay in reaching care, delay in receiving care. Reaching the hospital does not guarantee treatment, as many lack the proper infrastructure to provide emergency surgical care. As a result, many easily treatable conditions become diseases with high fatality rates. As many as 90% of maternal death could be averted by timely intervention. For those who successfully obtain treatment, 1/4 will experience financial catastrophe as a result of receiving surgical care. To save lives and prevent disability, an additional 143 million surgical procedures are required annually in developing countries. Today's surgical workforce will need to double in 15 years to reach our target of 80% coverage of timely access to essential services by 2030. The total costs required to reach these targets are significant, at approximately $350 billion by 2030. However, the costs of failure are even greater. The lost output will cost developing countries an estimated $12.3 trillion. Investing in surgical services is affordable, saves lives, and promotes economic growth, making surgery an indivisible, indispensable part of healthcare.
And without further ado, I'd like to invite Ruan up to introduce our first speaker for this evening. Thanks very much, everyone. I hope you enjoyed.
Hi guys, it's lovely to see all of you here this evening, and I just want to extend a warm welcome from the MedSoc side as well. Just a note, our talk tonight is being recorded, so that's just the obligatory word. So I'm very honoured this evening to introduce our first speaker. He is Professor Roger Dickerson. He is a specialist emergency physician and intensivist who heads up the emergency centre at New Somerset Hospital. He is a past president of the Colleges of Emergency Medicine. He's the current president of the Emergency Medicine Society of South Africa. And yeah, it's really lovely to have him here. He has a special interest, I've read up, on in ventilation, critical care, the adrenal access, and very fortunately for us this evening, fluids. So please join me in giving Prof Dickerson a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Josh. I must admit I was also looking to see who was going to step up to speak now after that introduction. So this is just typical for an emergency physician. We are quite schizophrenic. That's on there? Right. Right, then, if I can just draw your attention to this. All right, so thank you very much for that very warm introduction. As you heard, my name is Roger, and I'm not an alcoholic. It's not that kind of a meeting. But we are going to be talking about fluids. So, as was rightly mentioned, fluids is something that I have an interest in. And I don't just mean giving to my patients, I mean reading about them, not what was happening outside. So let's set the scene then when it comes to fluids.
What have we got?
Panieri, broken arms, fractured internal injuries, state infusions to the head.
And we've got Special Solutions Article Montana stack.
Strength?
1 part in a million.
I'm sure it was serious.
You're right. We need to strengthen the first. 1 part in 10 million.
Molly doctor.
That we got, Handle. Give me some wolfsbane, also known as monk's food in here. And a whole tray of flower remedies.
Well, the chakras are fading. We need some crystals.
Yes, there's just some purple city quartz. You're right. Make that aquamarine quartz. Okay, he's stabilizing. Now, does anybody know what sort of car he's in?
Blue for 1 day, apparently.
Right, get me a bit of blue for 1 day. Put it in water, shake it, dilute it, shake it again, dilute it again, do some more shaking, dilute it some more, then put 3 drops on his tongue. That was cured. I don't know what well.
Look at this, Simon.
What is it?
This course has not long to live.
What else?
Lifeline. Very short. It's not too clever either. Sagittarius. Brace yourself for a surprise.
Right. We can try drawing a bit more lifeline on with pyro. You got a better idea? Let's see what happens. 334. Ish.
Tough day.
I just smell some losing them.
It happens.
I don't know, sometimes I think a trace solution of deadly nightshade or a statistically negligible quantity of arsenic just isn't enough.
That's crazy talk, Simon. Okay, so you kill the odd patient with cancer or heart disease, or bronchitis, flu, chickenpox, or measles, but when someone comes in with a vague sense of unease or a touch of the nerves or even just more money than sense, you'll be left with a bottle of basically just water in one hand and a huge invoice in the other.
That's right.
Now, one drink.
I need one.
Excuse me. 2 more homeopathic lockers, please.
Whoa, that's strong stuff.
So I think you've learned all you need to know about fluids now. Right, so in the words of Meredith Grey, seriously, yes, I do watch Grey's Anatomy. I actually say that Christina Young was my favourite character, and mainly because she referred to everybody by number, which made life a lot easier. So this is what my backyard looked like a couple of months ago as we were in the heat of the drought. And it really emphasized the difficulties that we have when it comes to fluids and how dependent we are on fluids. And what the drought led to in our town is what we face in our patients. So that leads to some very difficult decisions ahead. Trying to decide whether or not we should be giving fluid, and if we are going to be giving fluid, what fluid? And the difficulty is that we are often caught between that so-called proverbial rock and a hard place. We're not really sure what to do. Josh mentioned earlier that he gets sent into Dr. Cropman's fluid room to get fluid and goes, I'll just take the biggest bag here. And I used to say that the right amount of fluid and the right fluid choice used to give me grey hair. But admittedly, I don't get that worried these days about grey hair, because when they turn grey, it actually means that they just haven't fallen out. So, let's talk about acute fluid loss. And here we get down to the dirty. We get down to the blood and the gore. Now, if you look at most of the recommendations that are provided or the literature around fluid management, it tends to be based on utopian ideals. When you've got a massive emergency department dealing with a single patient. I would love to work in that kind of environment, but I don't. I work in one where we are packed to the gills, and we need to make appropriate decisions quickly and make an assessment quickly and hopefully do something good for the patient at the same time. So really what I'm going to be talking about is this utopian ideal of the right fluid for the right patient at the right time, but adding that it should be for realists, understanding that we do work in a resource-constrained environment. So let's begin. Let's talk about the blood on the floor. We know that trauma accounts for a large number of deaths in our country. And in fact, a recent study has shown that it is the second largest cause of death after all of the infections put together. That scared me. Because trauma, by definition, is generally avoidable. Either you avoid the incident happening, or you can do something generally to try and avoid the death on the table. But we know that it accounts for many, many deaths around the world. Now, what causes the deaths in trauma? Hemorrhage. Okay, so Nick has done well. Not only is he Vice President, but he has proved he can read. All right, so when we talk about shock, we can say that shock is defined as a state of circulatory failure resulting from some insult. But the important thing is that it results in an inadequate cellular perfusion and an oxygen deficit at the tissue level. And that's what we are trying to prevent, that deficit of oxygen at that tissue level. And so we need to do everything we can in order to preserve that delivery of oxygen. And it's not like we can phone Mr. Delivery and say, get oxygen to the tissues, because it's not always that simple. But there are simple things that we can do in order to achieve it. And those are appropriate and adequate fluid resuscitation. We can talk about the use of vasopressor agents, so inotropes and vasopressors. And then we can talk about the greatest fluid of all. Whitney spoke about the greatest love of all. I'm speaking about the greatest fluid of all, and that is blood. The problem is that we don't often have it in the right place. Here's a picture of Prof Panieri's hands after his But literally the blood tends to be in our hands because we need to use it appropriately because it is such a limited and precious resource. Now, I said to you that I'm an emergency physician, and because of that I need to have a simple brain. And the reason I've got a simple brain is that I need to function the same whether it's 3 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And generally at 3 o'clock in the morning I don't actually remember my own name, let alone what is in each of the fluids. And so we need to keep it simple. What fluid should you give to replace fluid loss? Okay, I'm going to give you a clue that will last you for the rest of your careers. Okay, everybody ready to write it down? When anyone asks you that kind of a question, the answer is, it depends. Okay, and it depends on what? What's lost. Okay, so again, that's an important thing to take home. The ideal replacement fluid is to replace what has been lost. So it makes sense when you've got hemorrhagic shock to replace it with blood. What does it mean when you've got diarrhea? Okay, don't replace it with diarrhea, please. Okay? But you've got to look at the fluid that has been lost. So when you've got the medical causes of fluid loss, you're then looking at, you may be needing to replace plasma, you may be needing to replace electrolytes. When you're talking about trauma, we're talking about blood and blood products with platelets and FFP. But we know that in trauma, the best fluid to replace acute hemorrhagic fluid loss is with blood. So let's talk about blood. Just as a show of hands, who here has ever received donor blood? Okay, so we do have someone in the room. All right. Who here is a blood donor? Okay, that's a very, very, very good relationship. Okay, if I look at the number of you who are donors to those that are recipients, that's the way we should be looking at it. Because, quite frankly, I'm dependent on you to do my work. I'm dependent on myself to do my work as well, but I'm dependent on you. Because we're trying to manage our patients with acute fluid loss, we do need blood. And especially young blood like yours. Old blood like mine, you don't want anymore. So we know that blood is the most effective fluid to give in trauma. But we don't need to give too much. We certainly don't want to give too little, but we don't need to give too much. And so in these kinds of patients, we tend to target a hemoglobin level of 7 to 9 milligrams per deciliter. What's yours now? Okay, so that was a sneaky way of saying, do you know what the normal level of hemoglobin is? 12 to 15 for a female, quite correct. At sea level we'll count, but you're right. For males, should I pick on a male? So I've got an offer from your Vice President of 14 to, sorry,
70.
President-elect. 15 to 17, is it? 14 to 17,
Yeah.
didn't it?
Yeah.
Did you notice he's trying to make me correct him? So 14 to 16, okay. But you'll notice that when we are trying to circulate blood, blood is thick. Okay? How easy is it to pump it round when thick? Not that easy. So we're trying to get that balance between having enough hemoglobin to bring oxygen to the cells, but not so thick that we have to work so hard to get it there. And so it's a balance between oxygen carrying capacity on the one side and something called rheology, or the flow of blood, on the other. And in critically ill patients, we found that the magic number is 7 to 9. There are some patients that you may need to target higher levels, so patients with comorbidities, ischemic heart disease or something like that. Now, this site is all too common, and I think this is something that Prof Panieri can comment on, is that this is often what the theatre floor looks like in big trauma, because they are needing to give massive amounts of fluid. And you'll notice there, just by looking at the number of blood bags on the floor, it would be considered massive, a massive transfusion. And a massive transfusion is noted as being anything that is more than 50% of your blood volume. That's a lot more than 50% of that patient's blood volume. Many years ago, I started out in anesthetics, and I was hanging a bag of blood. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, my eyesight isn't great, and I managed to put the spike of the drip through the side of the bag. And the bag just exploded with blood onto the floor. I mean, it's a precious resource, I know. But the surgeon looked up and said, "Ha! You moan at me about my blood loss." So I just replied, "No, I just thought I'd save time and pour it straight on the floor." Now, by doing that, I could actually hear the surgeons in the room. I could hear those adrenals squeezing because I was insulting the surgeons. But I wanted you to feel that surge because our next topic is the use of inotropes. Right. So the use of inotropes in trauma is controversial. Right. Initially, if you look at the original Advanced Trauma Life Support Guidelines, they would say to you, do not use inotropes in trauma, it kills. And you want to say, actually, no, trauma kills. We're just trying to do our best. So I'm going to give you an example. I have a swimming pool. It has, I don't actually, but I have a swimming pool. It consists of a pool, a pump, and some fluid. You've seen the analogy. Okay? So the pool itself are the blood vessels. The pump is the heart, the fluid is the blood. So, with all this lack of rain, and I'm not allowed to fill my swimming pool anymore, the level has dropped. My pool is shocked. So what can I do? So we've just said I could give fluid. I could just fill it up. But the mayor says, no, 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 no. So what else can I do? I can try and make that pump work harder. But if there's not enough fluid for that pump to pump, we are going to put that pump into failure. That's not good. What else can we do? Oh, tell me what you just said. I saw the hand action. You make the swimming pool smaller. So it's quite correct, because then we get a better balance between the amount of fluid and the size of the pool. Now, in our bodies, we have this expansile pool of blood that we call our blood vessels. If we vasoconstrict, it makes that pool smaller. Now, this is a natural phenomenon that we see during a shock scenario, and that the patient themselves will often vasoconstrict. Some of them can't. And so the administration of inotropes not only makes that pump work harder, but it makes that swimming pool smaller to give you the time to fill up that pool. And that's what we're doing with inotropes and vasopressors, is buying a little bit of time in order to fill them up. Who here likes to bath? Okay, I didn't mean wash. I understand that people shower as well. I mean specifically bath. Hands up? Okay. Would you consider yourself a bath expert? Okay. All right. Shall we test this? Okay. What is your first step in filling your bath? She is a bath expert. Now the trauma scenario applies. It's no good pouring fluid in if we haven't put in the plug. So if you haven't put in the plug, it's no good. So stop the bleeding and then fill them up. And that is often where we will delay our fluid and blood resuscitation using inotropes until we are trying to get that bleeding stopped. Because otherwise, like my earlier analogy, the blood will end up on the floor, and that's not good. So let's talk about the other fluids that are available. So, anyone got some ideas about the fluids that are available other than blood? So this is, I'm seeing, is the when in doubt, mumble. Give me a fluid.
Crystalloids.
Crystalloids, that's a nice big group, I like it. So on that same line, crystalloids and colloids. I can leave now. So crystalloids and colloids. Now, what crystalloids are you aware of? Well, we're not allowed to say names yet. This is the big group. So we've got crystalloid. Isotonic, hypertonic, It's quite sweet. We've now got infrared lighting in the corner. The way we divide them up is looking at the balance of the electrolytes. And so we speak about the balanced and the unbalanced solutions. So now, I feel bad now, so now Josh. Have I got your name on me? You know, it's really
it's close to John. Right.
So as my registrars tell me every single day, this kind of action occurs because I'm very, very old. So I apologize, John.
Right.
That was done on purpose. Especially when his colleague is going. All right. Your fluid, where would you put it? Balanced or unbalanced?
Balanced.
Okay. So, now we come to the question, what do I mean by a balanced salt solution? And it's really where you're ensuring that when you have put the fluid into the body, you are maintaining a balance between the positive ions and the negative ions. So it's not necessarily what's hanging in the bag, but what happens when you put it in the body. And it brings us to a concept of the strong iron difference. And what we are looking at is the difference between the sodium and the chloride. You don't walk around shocking everything, or not all the time unless you're scrubbing your feet on the ground on a carpet or something. You tend to maintain electrical neutrality, and we do that by expanding or contracting bicarb, the hydronium ion, HCO3. My question to you is, which is better to have? You want to have more or less bicarb? Okay, let's have a go. More? Okay, I see people doing the... So, it's a bit of a trick question. What we are actually saying is a bit like Goldilocks. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. So not too high, not too low, just right. What we're trying to do is maintain electrical neutrality in the body. Who here has hung a bag of fluid, one of the crystalloids? Okay, now you see they're doing it again. I know if I put my hand up high, he's going to pick on me. Okay, so, what fluid did you hang?
Saline, normal saline.
Normal saline. Right. Did you look on the bag when you hung it up? Other than saying its name?
No.
You didn't look at the expiry date or?
No.
Okay.
I basically got handed this before, stick it in and put it out.
Okay. All right. So a couple of important things, and I will speak about this at the end, is what to check before you hang the fluid. Always look at the electrolytes that are contained in that fluid when you are going to hang it up. But the other thing I want you to go and look at when you get back to your wards tomorrow morning is at the pHs of those fluids. Okay. We say normal saline. In fact, we use it and we put it in our contact lenses and everything's hunky-dory. If you look at the pH of normal saline, firstly, does anyone know the pH of pool acid? So depending on the mix, anything between 1.8 and 2. Pool acid, yeah. What about normal saline? 4.5. Okay. What is normal pH or physiological pH? So what we're saying is that normal saline is closer to pool acid than it is to our own physiology. But we call it normal. And in fact, Professor Mike James, who was the head of anesthesia here for many years, wrote a very good article where he called it abnormal saline. And it's because when you put it into the body, it narrows that strong iron difference, makes you shed bicarb, and you become more and more acidotic. So do we have fluids where we have a differing level of sodium and chloride? Like the non-orange president of the US said, yes we can, and yes we do. And what was the thing is that we've had these fluids around for a long time. So if we look at Ringer's lactate, and we look at Balsol or plasma-like B, they have got differing levels of sodium and chloride. And because of that, their pHs are better. So Ringer's pH, you're going to go and look at the bag next time, 6.1. What about plasma-like B or Balsol, same fluid, different manufacturers? 7.4. Just by manipulating that balance between sodium and chloride. And the studies have shown that this is significant in what we give to our patients. And so unless there is a very special reason, when we are giving these isotonic crystalloids, we need to ensure that we are giving them the right reason and selecting the fluid specifically. Because if we don't, they can have deleterious effects. We can make our patients more acidotic. We can give them so much fluid that they become edematous. and we can disrupt the cellular functions, particularly within the kidneys. And so some of the complications that we can see if we give the wrong fluid or the wrong amount of fluid is things like increased incidence of ARDS, kidney failure, and from a surgical perspective, worsening your wound healing. They'll stay longer in your ward, and you can't do your elective surgery like you'd like to. So it's a bit of a problem. So wait a minute, I've only been focusing here on these things called crystalloids. Now, someone else gave me a nice broad group where they spoke about colloids. And the difficulty is that all of these scenarios are written for emergency departments that look like this. Right? Beautiful, but seldom do. They tend to look like this. Right, and this was a quiet Monday morning, but it keeps us out of mischief. So we need to look at some of the studies that have been done here. And when I mean here, I don't just mean South Africa, but actually based at this hospital and within UCT. There was a great study that was done by Andy Nicol and Mike James looking at the administration of a certain colloid in trauma. And here we're speaking about the hydroxyethyl starches. And what the hydroxyethyl starch is a polymer of corn, of maize. It's a specific type, but what it does is that it is able to retain fluid within the intravascular space. And by doing so, you can limit the amount of fluid you're giving and still get the benefit of that fluid staying in the intravascular space. And what they demonstrated in their study, that in trauma patients, they showed improvement compared to crystalloid fluids. I agree, it's exciting. They demonstrated that in penetrating trauma, there was a decreased incidence of renal injury. There was not an increased use of blood and blood products, and it was not associated with bleeding, which we do see associated with some of the crystalloids that we administer. This was a big deal. And some guys from the overseas, so Jajali Anand is a very good researcher. He's based in Paris, and they did a comparison using the hydroxyethyl starches and compared it to Renus lactate, and again showed a significant improvement in the patients that we are seeing. Now you notice they have not compared this to blood. This is a comparison to the use of crystalloids. And it really is pointing us in the way that we need to limit the amount of fluid that we are giving to our patients. So in order to do that, we need to give them as little blood as possible because it is a precious fluid. But in total, we need to give them as little fluid as possible. Again, showing very similar results to the first trial of Mike James. It's also been shown to be of benefit in burns, where we are giving large quantities of fluids. So we don't tend to follow it that much anymore, but the Parkland formula used to tell us that we used to have to give between 3 and 4 mils per kg per percent burn surface area. So for easy maths, a 100 kilogram person with a 50% body surface area times by 3 to 4 is a large amount of fluid. And that's delivered within the first 24 hours. 24 liters in 24 hours. That's big. But again, by giving the hydroxyethyl starches, they diminished the amount of fluids that they were needing to give and showed improvement with morbidity and mortality. The big trial with regards to hydroxyethyl starches, which was fairly scathing and negative in a lot of areas, demonstrated that, and it was a negative trial, meaning that they were looking for problems, not looking for benefit. And so they demonstrated that there was no difference in 90-day mortality between giving the fluids, the hydroxyethyl starches or the crystalloids. Now I have to say, Dr. House is one of my favorite personalities. He says a lot of the things that I wish I could say. But the important thing to understand is that fluids don't have brains. So you need to use yours when selecting the appropriate one. The other thing I need to warn you is that everybody lies. I might have been lying this whole time. The point that I'm trying to make is that whenever you are looking at whether it's an article, a journal, a chapter in a textbook, you need to assimilate it with what you already know. Does this fit or doesn't it? Because at times we can get to that point that we follow blindly and get our patients into trouble. Not ourselves, we get our patients into trouble. And lastly, just to finish up, the fluid of choice is blood. Right. But if it's on our hands, instead of in the patient, it's a problem. So where you can, please do give blood. When you can't, give crystalloid and colloid. And give as little of those two as possible. And in order to do that, we should probably be considering colloid.
This has a fractured fibula. Well, so you can be able to go on tomorrow.
Daddy's going to be so excited.
That killed him.
Do you have any questions? Are there any questions, guys? Sorry, ma'am.
I just want to ask, so you didn't really speak much on this, but as a side point, so normal saline versus ringers, we're always told very possible when we put ringers up. But in the emergency units, it seems like often there's just normal saline around. I just want to know on a system level why that's the case. Is it just a tender that we still have? Why is it there?
So, I completely support what you've been told, is that ringers in preference to saline. What you also need to understand is that you'll find that the different companies have different names for the fluids. So if there isn't ringers, look for Plasmolite L, because that's what's got the tender at the moment. It is the same fluid. All right. The reason that saline is around is that there are old fogies like me still around, and some of us, not me, like normal saline. And you'll find that still a lot of protocols are based out of normal saline. The literature that I've been discussing with you this evening about the balanced solutions is new. When I say new, probably while you were still at school, but new in the greater scheme of things. But it is something that we are working towards. Ideally, I would like to have Belsol for all of the units, or Plasmolite B, rather than Plasmolite L or ringers, because of the improvement that has been shown. But I think we're a little way off of that. So where you've got the option, go with your balanced salt solution, being ringers or Belsol. Does that answer your question? So, was he first? I think I owe him.
So you made quite a strong case this evening for the use of colloids. That you also began your talk about speaking about the source constraints where the colloids are significantly more expensive than crystalloids. So how do you kind of bring these two backs together?
Okay, so just to repeat the question so that everyone was able to hear, we operate within a resource-constrained environment, and that's what I spoke about at the beginning. We know that the cost of the colloids is quite a bit. It's certainly quite a bit more than we see with the crystalloids, and how do we balance off the use of one or the other? Probably the most expensive fluid is actually blood. Looking anything between, depending on the type, anything between 2.5 and 5,000 rand a unit. Okay. If you're looking at the colloids, they're about 250 rand a unit, and the crystalloids, again, depending on what you're looking at, anything between 20 and 50 rand. So it gives you a differential of what we're looking at. But how much does a day in ICU cost you? Okay, 20 to 25,000 a day in state. So if you are able to shorten the ICU stay by 1 day, it's a significant saving. So when you're looking at the health economics, it's a big picture type of scenario. That being said, we want to limit as much as possible the amount of fluid that we are giving in total. And so certainly within the resuscitation environment, we tend to go a little bit of crystalloid, so we are filling them up, then give colloid to keep it in there, and then adding blood where the patient needs it. I don't know if that answers your question. Sir?
Kind of in the same vein, I don't know if I'm misinformed, but
It was quite a good pun.
Yeah.
So I know colloids, don't they often have a higher rate of allergic reaction? And if they do, how does the hydroxyethyl starch compare to that? And how does that fall within a risk-benefit kind of analysis?
Should I answer the question? It depends. So it depends on the colloid. All right, so the older colloid absolutely had a very high level of anaphylaxis. In fact, the one that we tended to use quite a bit at the time, the dextran, were so bad that it was causing about 1 in 4 patients to have an allergic reaction, that they actually started adding anti-dextran antibodies to the dextran to try and diminish it. So the older fluids, absolutely. With regards to the newer fluids, much diminished, and it is higher. There is a higher anaphylaxis rate certainly in the hydroxyethyl starches compared to the crystalloids. The hydroxyethyl starches are the lowest of the colloids, so lower than the gelatins, which is the other colloid that we have available to us. The benefit, though, is that it doesn't cause you to bleed, and we know that the crystalloids do. They dilute your clotting factors, and you end up bleeding quite significantly. There's a problem with the older colloids as well, that it made you bleed, but certainly the newer colloids, they are better in that regard. I admittedly have seen anaphylaxis from gelatins, but not from the hydroxyethyl starches. I'm going to be welcome to ask me questions afterwards, but I don't want to delay Prof Panieri in London, so thank you very much.
So I'd quickly like to just introduce Prof Panieri before he kicks off. So Prof is a stalwart of emergency and general surgery in South Africa. He graduated from UCT, went on to specialize in general surgery with a special interest in endocrine and oncology. And he's also the chief specialist currently of the Cape Metro West emergency surgery. So definitely a wealth of knowledge that we can learn a lot from, and incidentally gives the tut on fluids in 6th year. So for those of you not in 6th year, this is a good starting point. So Prof Panieri, over to you.
Thanks, Josh. Okay, so Roger and I are very, very impressed that we have this audience, and it's kind of quite hard work to keep you awake for another hour. I'm not going to talk for an hour, I promise. Okay. Roger says he's going to talk for 20 minutes. That was about an hour and a half. Yeah, maybe 2. To me at the back anyway, it felt like ages. And as he says, everybody lies. So I'm going to talk to you about fluid and electrolytes, but I'm actually not going to talk about electrolytes. So this is a lie. I'm just going to talk about fluids. But generally, if you get the fluid volume right, the electrolyte concentration it matters a little bit less. Okay, and this talk is a rehash of a TUT that I gave in 6th year, so it's an apology to those of you who've heard it. And it's very practical, it's non-fancy, it's just going through some of the basic principles. And it always strikes me as a clinician that often the students and the junior doctors are puzzled by fluids, and it's a very simple thing. You really don't have to make it complicated. So I'll try and just explain to you some of the concepts behind it and give you a few practical troubleshooting hints. So why do we talk and teach you about fluids in surgery? It's because in surgical wards, loads of patients are in a drip, okay? More so than in other medical disciplines. Because a whole lot of our patients, where's the pointer? Anyway, I'll use this one. A lot of our patients are kept nil per mouth because of the worry that if they've eaten something and they have an anesthetic, they can vomit and aspirate. So it's a prerequisite of anesthesia preparation that the patient should have an empty gut. So the patient arrives in the hospital and they're kept nil per mouth. Then they have an operation. They often can't eat well for a couple of days thereafter, so they're still nil per mouth. They may be booked for a scan or an ultrasound, and some of those are affected whether there's fluid in the stomach, so they're kept nil per mouth. So a lot of patients just sit there with a drip waiting for something to happen. Okay, and this is a picture of a patient that's in our ward this morning, and it's a classic profile of the things that you need to manage. This is a poor patient with TPN, feeding tube, intravenous lines, weird stuff coming out of stomas and drains, which all have big impact on fluid and electrolyte needs. So my talk is not at all about resuscitation, it's about the day-to-day management of fluid in a surgical patient. So to keep it very simple, we're not talking about anything fancy. What's in a drip is really a combination of water, salt, and sugar. Okay? That's all there is. Water, this is a nice picture of a running mountain stream. A couple of salty products that I wish I could be eating now. There's a salami, half of it I've eaten already. And a range of sugary things that were in our house a while ago. Okay? And in the reality, for the standard patient who's recovering from an uncomplicated operation, who's on a drip for a day or two, you can kind of do whatever you like, they're going to be okay. Okay? And if they arrive with a functioning kidney and their heart pumps without going to pulmonary edema at the drop of a hat, it doesn't matter what you give them, they'll be okay. That saves the majority of the patients from your incompetence and from your willful neglect. But clearly there'll be some that are much more delicate than you expect. And the biggest danger in surgical wards is excessive fluid administration. We're so worried about fluid losses that we over-exuberant with fluids, and particularly the elderly patients who've got subclinical borderline organ dysfunction tend to be overloaded and can go into pulmonary edema, and those are the problems that you'll see. Okay, so I'm going to explain to you some of the concepts of what maintenance fluids are like and what they're about. Remind you of a few basic principles of stress reactions and reactions to trauma of surgery that you need to just remember. I'll give you an overview of what types of fluids are available for you to choose from. To answer that question that Roger posed, is what fluid you get out. He hasn't really answered it, just blood. Give him blood. I'm going to tell you a lot more about that. And then a couple of practical examples. So the issue is that patients arrive, they're nil per mouth. If you stay nil per mouth for a reasonable period of time, the patient's going to become dehydrated. They may develop an electrolyte deficit, especially if they've got other losses, and they're starving. Okay? So because we keep them nil per mouth, there's a concept that to counteract that, we need to give them some form of maintenance balanced fluid, not to harm them in this way. Okay? That's the concept of maintenance fluids. Maintenance fluids are about water, some sort of salty electrolyte stuff, and some form of caloric intake. So how much maintenance you give them? The maintenance value you give them is based on very old studies that try to estimate what would be the average water intake of an adult in a day. Okay, and it was worked out that the average adult would need somewhere between 1.5 to 3 liters of water a day if they don't take anything by mouth and they're not eating anything to maintain themselves in a status quo. Okay? So in maintenance, in principle, you're working on that volume of water to keep someone going. And you can be as vague as that. Okay? So what I tend to do is if I've got in a bed a patient who weighs 150 kilograms and looks like a lock for the Stormers, I'm happy to go for 3 liters. If it's a tiny little granny, you're looking a liter, not much more than that. Okay. The other thing to always remember is that if you have patients that are intravenous lines and having infusions of antibiotics and inotropes and blah, 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 the classic triple antibiotic regime, pen, gentoflagell, every antibiotic is mixed in a little bag of fluid. It's given 3 times a day, 3 different drugs. By the end, you get almost a liter of extra fluid just to give the patient the drugs that they're receiving intravenously. So you need to bear those things in mind when you decide what would be the basic volume of fluid that you give them. Okay. What's mixed up inside this maintenance fluid that you give them is a combination of electrolytes, and the 2 electrolytes that are of critical importance in the short term, that as clinicians we see causing problems, are sodium and potassium. There are obviously lots of others with theoretical derangements, but in the standard surgical setting, they're not that common a problem. So we don't really bother to look for them or manage them specifically in the maintenance context. Okay. So the things that you worry about are sodium and potassium, and these are nice, beautiful charts that you don't understand what they're about. They're just there to put some pictures. You always have to have a picture and some text just to break the monotony of the talk. But the only message about this picture is to remember that sodium is predominantly an extracellular electrolyte, and potassium is intracellular. So when you do a blood test on a patient, you find out that their sodium is 139 and their potassium is 5. It doesn't mean that the daily requirement of sodium and potassium is 130 and 5. You're just measuring the extracellular concentration of those electrolytes. And in fact, the daily requirements of sodium and potassium are very similar. You need somewhere to about a millimole per kilogram per day. So about 70 to 100 millimoles of sodium and potassium a day are what's thought to be the regular intake that one would take through food and other stuff to keep yourself going. Okay? So you want to give them 2 to 3 liters of water, give them 70 to 100 millimoles of sodium and potassium, and then you want to give them some form of caloric intake.
To top up your omega-3 DHA, you could lead the life of the Inuit Eskimo. Their omega-3 rich diet has contributed towards their healthy lives.
Just to wake you up. Okay, so the patient's not eating. What are the caloric requirements? The average adult will need to have somewhere around 15 to 600 kilocalories a day. So that's the maintenance that you're trying to get to in someone who's nil per os, and there they are. Okay, we'll come back to what maintenance fluids we have and how close they come to meeting these needs when we look at fluid types. But obviously your patients aren't in hospital just to starve and do nothing. They're there because they're sick. Okay, so there are a number of physiological responses to illness and trauma that affect your fluid management and the clinical recovery of the patient, and I'm just going to mention those in the next slides. And then also very importantly in surgery is that we're dealing with often a lot of other excess losses. Patients vomit, they've got diarrheas, they've got funny drains with stuff pouring out, and those fluid losses can cause severe problems if you don't note them and if you don't correct them, and if you don't know what's coming out. And as a basic principle, all sick patients don't have the normal caloric needs. They usually have excess metabolic needs, caloric needs, because they become catabolic. So you need to actually give them more than the basic maintenance in terms of nutritional needs. So these are just one slide to rehash a year's worth of biochemistry for you. But when someone is recovering from an operation, or has had massive trauma, or is septic, they have 2 main endocrine systems that are triggered as a response to this event. Okay, the first one is ACTH and cortisol, And what happens at a cellular organ level is that there's gluconeogenesis, there's breakdown of glycogen, there's fat and protein breakdown, and all that does is that it strives to produce lots of glucose to float around the blood to keep the heart pumping and the brain functioning, simplistically put. Okay? And what you will see as clinicians is that very sick patients often have an abnormally high blood glucose, especially with sepsis. It doesn't mean they're diabetic. It means that this is what's going on. Okay? So you can't make the diagnosis of diabetes in an acutely ill patient. You have to wait for it to recover and recheck and retest. And you find a lot of those were just having a response to the illness and not true diabetic derangement. Okay? So that's one side of it. And the other thing is specifically in response to fluid and water loss, which are common pathologies in surgery, elective and emergencies. You have aldosterone and ADH triggered. The main purpose is to retain salt and water. Okay? And from a clinical point of view, what you see is that this endocrine system, together with the fact that they've got a drip and we're pumping them full of fluids, patients often become edematous. Okay? Especially if you use crystalloids as opposed to colloids, but both will do that to some degree. Okay? So it's one of the first things that nursing staff will do in a patient that comes out of theatre, goes to ICU, take the rings, the watches off, and it's not that they're selling the cash crusaders. They just know those patients are going to puff up, and they'll be edematous for a couple of days until it switches off. So the first 2 to 3 days, it's not unusual for a patient not to pass a lot of urine because they tend to retain fluid because it's driven by the aldosterone and ADH. And they go past a litre and a bit. By day 3, day 4, if they're getting better and there's no problem, what we often see is a very clear turning point, and they become a little bit polyuric, and they pass 3-4 litres of urine. By the end of the first week, they settle back down to normal, and that's fine. So these are common things that you'll see. Usually by the end of the first week, the great majority of patients are out of hospital and gone. But you always need to remember that an anabolic phase, so the phase of recovery of the fat, protein, muscle bulk, glycogen stores, endurance, muscle tone, will take months. Okay? A major operation or a significant septic event is a huge physiological insult, and patients will sometimes never recover back to the original level of strength and fitness. Okay? And that happens outside of the clinical gaze. It's an ongoing process. Someone who's had a laparotomy for a septic abdomen goes out of hospital in 7 days. They're not going to hike the Otter Trail in 3 weeks. Okay? Maybe in 6 months. Okay? It's a long time before things are sorted out again. Okay, and then as I mentioned earlier, when you're dealing with a sick patient, your caloric requirements are greater. And generally, the sicker the patient, the more there are. The most extreme cases are usually burns patients. And major burns are complex from a nutritional point of view. And if you work in burns units, you'll work hand in hand with nutritionists and dietitians who've got a real challenge to feed patients calories that would be the equivalent of what Michael Phelps would need to eat in the Olympics. Okay? It's very hard to eat that amount of calories if you're not feeling well. And it takes a huge amount of ingenuity and tricks and feeding tubes and all that stuff to get them to feed them to the levels that they need. Okay, so those are some of the physiological responses. And then very important to surgery are the fact that our patients often have unusual losses. Bleeding things are trauma unit, emergency unit, theatre situations, and the resuscitation. That's what Roger's been talking about for the last 3 hours. In the ward, what you're dealing with are mostly other losses, and the most important ones are gut losses. Source of major gut losses: vomiting, diarrhea, stomas. Okay. You have other potential losses. So when you operate on someone and you open the abdomen or their chest, those patients often sequester fluid inside the peritoneal cavity or the thoracic cavity for a while, and that's considered a third space loss. They lose volume and you can't monitor it. So the perioperative anesthesia management has to deal with those issues. But from a practical point of view, the ones that we really look for are gut losses, and the others are more theoretical rather than important practical consideration. So this is a table that comes out of one of my old textbooks, and I found it just helpful to instruct you as to what kind of volume of losses you can expect depending what part of the gut is losing it. okay, with an estimate of what the electrolyte concentrations are at that site. So if you take someone's stomach and you tie it off at the pylorus, a gastric outlet obstruction scenario, you'll find that the patient can lose up to 2.5 liters of water in a day. Okay? The concentration inside that has 80 millimoles of sodium, 15 of potassium, some bicarbonate, and then a variable amount of mass of acid, depending if they have normal acid production, excess acid production, as in a peptic ulcer kind of scenario, or not that much, as in a gastric cancer, who often have achlorhydria and a relatively non-functional stomach. Okay? So not surprisingly, if someone's got gastric outlet obstruction, they become dehydrated because the volume is a lot. They lose sodium, they become hyponatremic, and if they lose lots of acid, they can become a bit alkalotic. Okay. If you cut the bile duct and you have bile pouring out, there's 1.5 liters of bile a day, and bile looks a little bit like plasma, looks like a blood test. 150 sodium, 5 mL of potassium. It's an alkaline fluid. Pancreatic fluid is a little bit less, very similar to bile. It's very alkaline, so pancreatic losses make patients acidotic very quickly. Okay. Small bowel is predominantly a problem of volume. So not surprisingly, you've got a whole lot of gastric juices, bile and pancreatic juices going to the gut. If you have a hole in it and it pours out of a stoma, especially proximal small bowel, you can lose 3, 4, 5 liters of water in a day. And the electrolyte concentration of those, again, intuitively, is halfway between gastric and HPB fluids, as those two fluids intermingle and they're floating their way down. Okay. And then diarrheic diseases, the volumes can vary enormously. If you ever look after a patient with cholera, they can literally dehydrate themselves to death overnight. You can lose 5, 10 liters of water in a short period of time with cholera. And diarrheal illnesses have a slightly higher loss of potassium and bicarbonate. So diarrheic patients become hypokalemic and acidotic, as well as losing the volume. Okay. All right, so you've got all those losses. You worked out there's maintenance fluids, there's also this kind of stuff. You go to the ward and you say, what fluid do I give a patient? What's going on? This is our fluid chart in F17. You go a bit closer, there's dextrose, there's plasmolite B, there's sodium chloride, mentolite, dextrose again, sodium chloride. They've got a whole lot of other stuff. And you look a little bit like Donald Trump saying, who cares? I don't know. Doesn't matter. Okay. So these are the fluids that are available in most hospitals in South Africa. And I think it's important to try and conceptualize them into 3 categories. Okay? There are fluids that are meant to deal with maintenance. So there are the fluids that you give to the patient who's not eating anything at all to take care of those 2 to 3 liters and 70 millimoles of sodium, potassium, and whatever. Okay? That's one bunch of fluids. Then there are fluids that we use to replace losses or to rehydrate the person who's been vomiting and who's lying in casualty. Okay? And then the fluids that we use to resuscitate the shocked patient who's bled out or who's in hypovolemic shock. And as a principle, you must use the fluids for the correct indication. So maintenance fluid is a very bad resuscitation fluid. And resuscitation fluid is not a good maintenance fluid, and vice versa. Okay? The volume of water will be okay, but everything else in between is often wrong and can be harmful if you use it excessively in that context. Okay. So, maintenance fluids. The fluid that we have at risk here is GMS, stands for General Maintenance Solution. And that's bought on governmental tenders, available all around the country. In some hospitals, you may still find Mentolite. This was very widely bought in the 90s. I'm not sure if it's still around at all, but there's still a few around a couple of years ago. Basically, these are maintenance fluids, and these were designed with the assumption that the patient is going to get 3 liters a day. So each liter of GMS contains 1/3 of the daily requirements of sodium and potassium. Okay? So that's how you get to a concentration of 26 millimoles of sodium, 27 millimoles of potassium. All right. Then it has nothing else except 5% dextrose. 1 liter 5% dextrose is equivalent of 200 kilocalories. Okay, so if you give a patient 3 liters of GMS, you're going to make the water okay, although you could possibly overhydrate small people. You're going to be okay with sodium and potassium, and you're going to give them some calories, but you're a long way short of caloric support. So what we know is that maintenance fluids are not nutrition at all. These are not life-sustaining fluids in the long term. It's just enough dextrose to stop the patient being hypoglycemic and feeling terrible. But it's not in any way something that supports life in the long term. Maintenance is very similar. It's got a bit of calcium, magnesium, and other things in it, but it's effectively the same thing. Okay, so we are comfortable to use these, and the patient is not eating for a few days. But if we expect that patient's gut to be out of order for longer than a week or 10 days, we do not rely on these at all, and we shift towards using TPN. Okay, and TPN is a whole lecture on its own, and TPN, if used correctly, can keep someone alive for 15 years. So it's a complete nutrition. But the main problems with TPN are that it's incredibly expensive. It's well over 1,000 rand a day. It needs to go through central lines, and central lines have major morbidity and complications of their own. So we're very cautious about using it, and most patients are okay and they get better. So within a week or 10 days, 95, 98% of gut operations are settled, and you don't have to go there. So we just accept that we don't nourish them because given the caloric nutrition combination TPN is so expensive and potentially dangerous in some patients. So we just say, well, it's better than nothing. But it's not perfect. So that's the maintenance concept. The rehydration replacement fluids are a concoction of stuff. Remember that the dehydrated patients you see are almost all patients who've had a gastrointestinal acute illness. Gastroenteritis, vomiting, diarrhea, bowel obstructions, those kind of things. So they're losing volume, and that volume's got quite a high concentration of sodium. Okay. So you can start from normal saline, and normal saline is just salt water and nothing else. Okay. There's no dextrose, no potassium, zalsalt. Half normal saline is not surprisingly half normal saline. So if it's got 154, it goes to 77 millimoles of sodium chloride and nothing else. 5% dextrose is 5% dextrose and nothing else. It's sugar water. Okay. We use 5% dextrose very seldom because if you give 5% dextrose to someone who's got a sodium deficit, who's hyponatremic, you're going to make it worse. And hyponatremia, when it drops below 120, can be fatal. So 5% dextrose is not a great fluid. You can really use it in patients that we know tolerate sodium boluses very badly. So it's taught that portal hypertensions with intractable ascites is better managed with low sodium concentration fluids, and 5% dextrose got a role perhaps in that. Otherwise, we hardly ever use it. Okay. And then you have rehydration fluid, which is actually half normal saline with 5% dextrose thrown inside. So this is quite a versatile fluid. It's a very simple fluid, and it's the casualty rehydrate the dehydrated patient kind of fluid. The patient arrives, they come in, they say, geez, doc, I've been vomiting for the last 6 hours, I don't know what's going on. They have to be dehydrated. You look at them, you say, okay, well, maybe he's in renal failure and his potassium is 10. I don't know what his potassium is, so I'm going to find a fluid that doesn't have potassium inside, because you don't want to give a potassium-containing fluid to a hyperkalemic patient. We know that he's likely to be vomiting gastric content. So rehydration is good. It's got 5% dextrose, so he automatically is going to wake up and feel a bit better. He's not hypoglycemic anymore. And that's your entry-level rehydrate option. And replacement fluid is a fluid that was designed to be matching the average nasogastric loss of a post-operative surgical patient. So many, many years ago, they took a whole bunch of patients who had a nasogastric tube after an operation, and they just did an average of what's inside that fluid. And then they said, let's just make a fluid that is an exact match so we can replace those losses and keep the patient more or less balanced. And that's how they came up with replacement fluid with those kind of concentrations, which you see are very similar to what we think small bulk content looks like. Okay? And since we know that our maintenance fluids never give the patient enough calories, it's got 5% dextrose added in because that gives the patient a little bit of extra and keeps them keeps them going. So those are the rehydration fluids. And then resuscitation fluids, that's the lecture that you just heard. These are combinations that from an electrolyte point of view all look pretty much like plasma. They've got sodium 135, potassium 4 to 5.4, and other stuff. So obviously the colloids have got some kind of osmotic compound inside them, a starch or some kind of big molecule to maintain them in the circulating volume. But from an electrolyte point of view, they are all quite similar. Okay, so those are all the fluids that you have, and I'm almost done. You know about the concept of maintenance and why we've got those fluids with those concentrations. And then the next couple of slides are just going through the day-to-day things of what do you do when you do a ward round. Okay, so I think one of the important concepts is that in your day-to-day management of patients, you need to have clear in your head which patients do you worry about in terms of electrolytes and which ones you don't. And there are lots of surgical patients where we don't worry about that at all. So in my ward, when I look after someone who's had a mastectomy or a thyroidectomy, I write, when the patient wakes up, take the drip down, feed them supper, that's it. That's my fluid electrolyte management. There's nothing wrong with the gut. I'm not going to rely on a drip to do it. They can eat. Okay? And the same thing goes for ENT, plastic surgery, urology, orthopedics, a huge volume of surgery. It doesn't have a big deal with fluids. Okay? So you don't have to treat everybody in the same way. But the patients with fluids are often a problem, are gut problems. So gut surgery is dangerous, dangerous surgery, and we see lots of electrolyte problems. Okay? So anyone who's had a gut operation or who declares a gut problem, they're vomiting, they've got diarrhea, they've got funny pipes with drains coming out, look out for electrolyte problems. We know that burns are very complex and very detailed fluid requirements, especially in the resuscitation phase. And anyone who's got severe systemic sepsis, fluids are a very important part of the first 24, 48 hours of management. Okay, they're going to septic shock, and they often have greater fluids needs than you think. They're not losing them anyway, but you need to resuscitate them. So those are patients where you often need to give more fluids than you think. And the two other groups are patients where you can be harmful by giving fluids. And those are patients with organ failure, and elderly patients often have a dodgy ticker. They just haven't declared it yet. So they arrive in hospital and you give them 3 liters of Maintenolite and bang, all of a sudden they've got a problem. So in those patients you need to be alert to fluid restriction as part of your thinking. Okay? So these are the patients that you worry about. The others, you can literally take the drip down and say, go for it. Eat what you want. Go to the toilet. I'm okay. Okay? And you don't have to have your nursing staff being paranoid about them. And focus your nursing staff's work on the risky ones and let the other ones look after themselves. Okay. In these high-risk patients, what you want is you want to do things properly. And you don't need fancy anything. You just want to monitor and document the fluid status on a chart properly twice a day. So you need to do a morning ward round where you see what's happened the day before. You write your instructions. They need to be clear and common sense. And then you do an afternoon ward round to check whether your instructions are happening and whether the patient's getting better or not. Okay? And that's it. Okay? It's no fancy. You can do it in any conditions under the sun. You don't need anything other than a pen and paper and a measuring jug for the urine when the patient goes and passes urine in the toilet. Okay? And in the ward, your main focus is about replacing documented losses and just working out where does this patient fit in terms of their maintenance needs. Are they eating, or do I need to do that intravenously? And you work out what fluid volume they need. Are there any specific electrolyte concerns in this pathology in this person now? What's the nutritional state? And a basic rule of thumb, if a patient is hungry, feed the person. Okay? We've long moved away from the concept of you have an operation, day 1, milk per mouth, day 2, clear fluids, day 3, free fluids, day 4, soft diet, day 5, forward diet. If a patient wakes up and they are feeling able to tolerate some food, they can eat from day 0. It doesn't matter. Okay? And generally, the sooner patient recovers gut function, the sooner they get to hospital, and the better the outcome. There are lots of studies that show you that. Okay? So try and re-establish oral intake of food as soon as it's clinically tolerated, and encourage it. One-on-one with the patient, when you get to the bedside and you're trying to work out how much does this patient need, you always start by being the doctor. Being the doctor means you take a history. Your ward rounds are about interacting with the patient, not having a conversation with your colleagues about the rugby. Okay? So you get to Mrs. Jones, you say, Mrs. Jones, how are you feeling today? Are you feeling better? What did you have to eat yesterday? What did you have to drink? Are you feeling nauseous? Did you vomit? If we were to give you food, would you be able to tolerate it? How's that working out? Has your gut function? Have you passed flatus? Have you passed stool? Is it normal? Is there diarrhea? Is there something going on? Okay. Did you pass urine? Is it normal? Is it very little? Is it too much? Just get a feel. It takes you 10 seconds. Very easy. Okay. And then part of your physical examination, besides working out whether they're pain-free or all the kind of the surgical stuff, is you're trying to work out, are they dehydrated or are they overhydrated? So are they puffy and edematous, a bit short of breath, a bit of a tachycardia, a few crackles at the bases? You've given them too much. Okay? If they look like they've got dry lips and they just walk through the Kalahari, they're probably dehydrated. Okay? And it's as simple as that. Okay? And you put the whole package together in the clinical context and decide, is this person still dehydrated or are they okay? The next thing is, what are the tests and tools that you work out as to whether the patient is okay or whether the patient's out of balance? The single most important test that you do is that you look at the urine output. And generally speaking, if a patient's passing enough urine, whatever happened yesterday is likely to be okay. Okay? And the urine volumes that you calculate as being good versus insufficient are always arbitrary lines in the sand. What is taught is that if a patient passes more than 1 ml per kilogram per hour, things are great. Okay, so that's, a 70 kilogram man passing 70 ml an hour. That's a lot of urine. Things are fine. His kidneys are well perfused. No problem. If a patient passes less than 0.5 ml per kilogram per hour, it's a flag that things aren't quite right. Okay, so it's a 70 kilogram man passing 20 ml of urine an hour. That's not right. So they're probably a bit behind. And the primary reason for inadequate urine output in a surgical ward is usually being behind on fluids, not enough fluids. Although there are other causes, but that's the primary one. So generally, if the urine output is good, you don't need to do anything else. Things are fine. The other things that you monitor, look at with interest on the charts that are at the bedside. Look at what the patient ate or drank versus what they received intravenously, and also look with interest as to what they received intravenously and whether that was actually what you wanted them to get or whether they got less or more. There's often a huge gap between your orders, which are almost always right, and what actually happens. Okay, is because that's reality. The patient looks okay in the morning, then they go down to the CT scan, they drip tissues, and they come back to the ward at 4 in the afternoon, and instead of 2 liters, they've got nothing. Okay? And so you can't just assume that because you made the right decision in the morning, it's actually happened. That happens with all sorts of things. Bloods get sent off, the lab breaks the bottle. You write up the antibiotic, the nurse doesn't find it, it's not in stock, and the patient doesn't get it. So you've always got to check that things actually happen. Not that writing them on a piece of paper doesn't always make them happen. And you can do blood tests and other things, but in reality, you don't have to do electrolyte tests very often at all. In most patients, you don't do it once. If they're getting better and they're passing urine, just let them carry on. Okay, and that's the end of it. So you know about the maintenance things. You know about the different fluid types. Use the fluids for the specific context in which they're meant to be used. You can keep it very simple. And in most wards, you're going to be relying on the nursing staff to change the fluids. And there's a little tap, and the nurses look at it and close it and open it, and that's how it works. Okay, that's the reality. You've got rate minders, and rate minders in our hospitals are mostly kept for a few monitored beds close to the nurse's station, or perhaps the first 12 to 24 hours post-op. And then you can set it mils per hour and do a calculation to give them 3 liters of water or whatever. Okay, but in reality, most of the time you're right. 3 liters, and you go around each 2 or 3 times a day to check that they're getting it. If they're passing urine, you're doing okay. All right, that's it. And one last point to make it in case Professor Mendelssohn's hearing us, because he's got a bit of a sort of Darth Vader presence about him. And it's a real mission. Take the IV lines out. Okay? So an IV line is a fantastic tool when you need it, but if the patient doesn't need it anymore, don't leave it in the arm just in case. Okay? You often see that. Okay? You do that because it's such a hassle to put it in. You say, well, shucks, maybe we're going to need it again tomorrow or maybe the next day. And intravenous line sepsis is a major source of complication, major cost, major morbidity, and it's unnecessary. So if a patient doesn't need a drip, take the line out. Don't just close it and leave it. Okay? I had a patient a few years ago came back to me in outpatients 2 weeks after discharge. They still had a central line in their neck. Can you believe it? Okay, he just left and, discharged, summary, beautiful. They didn't take a central line. So if you don't need something, any pipe that's in the body, if it's not necessary, take it out as soon as possible. Catheters, drains, nasogastric tubes, get rid of this stuff. Okay, thank you.
Cool, so thank you everyone for attending. Thank you so much, Prof Panieri and Prof Dickerson. It was really lovely having you this evening. I'm sure I speak for all of us when we say we learned a lot. We just have a few small tokens of appreciation for having you here. If Matthew will come join me.
Thanks, John.
He gets the red one.
Yes. Yeah, blue for SurgSoc. So that's for you.
Thank you.
And Prof Dickerson, if you don't mind coming out. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And just a fun round of applause.
I'm going to have a nightmare about those blood-soaked hands.
Just look down every day.
Man.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers, everybody. Get home safe. All right.